And welcome our last storyteller of the evening to the stage. So Brad, I can't see you, but come on, Andie Goode.
Hi. Hi. I'm going to take this down and stand over here. Yeah. So the story, I named it The Power of a Name, but it should really be called the story about how I met Saddam Hussein, which is pretty cool, right? So here's how it started. My first day in Baghdad. I was full of confidence. I was full of motivation, and I already full on knew that I hated my new boss. I had just traveled over 26 hours to get to Baghdad, and I still was in my uniform. I still had all my stuff, like my rifle, my gear, and everything. But I'm standing at the position of attention, my back straight to report to this new boss. My uniform was, a little wrinkled, but as wrinkle-free and dust-free as I could have kept it throughout the travels. My hair was still perfect, slicked back in a bun with so much glue that no Marine Corps helmet, no desert heat could make it turn nasty. I was that locked on. Meanwhile, there's my new boss, who's an Army colonel. He's leaning casually against a wall, unpeeling an orange as he looks me up and down. He's got wrinkled camouflage utilities on that are faded from the sun and too worn, he should have retired them. And his hair is messy, which is hard to do with guys in the military whose hair is only like an inch long, but it was still messy. And he was looking at me while peeling this orange with the look of, I called it amused disdain. I was a newly minted Marine Corps judge advocate. I just had put on my captain's bars, and I was fresh out of law school. The time between earning my judge advocate title and the time before I was here now, standing in front of this Marine or Army colonel, was 37 days. I know it was exactly 37 days because the colonel made me count those days out loud in front of him. He then said, 37 days? And he looked at the office and all the other guys in the office. They all had their heads poked up over plywood cubicles. And the colonel goes, did you hear that? She's only been a judge advocate for 37 days. What am I going to do with you, Marine? And Marine, that's all he called me the whole rest of my deployment. He never called me by my name. He only called me Marine, or when he was talking about me, he would refer to me as the Marine. Go hand that to the Marine, or get over here, Marine. He didn't give me the job that I arrived there to fill. Instead, he gave me a job that he called the glorified tour guide. The glorified tour guide was actually, the official title was the Multinational Force Iraq Liaison Officer to the International Committee of the Red Cross, which is a mouthful. So some people just called it, the ICRC LNO, or glorified tour guide. The job was this. So the ICRC, the International Committee of the Red Cross, they're a delegation. That come from Geneva. They're mostly Swiss, and but for one really large Welsh doctor that they had and an equally large Lebanese interpreter, they were they were mostly fussy Swiss. And their job was to tour our detention facilities and to check to make sure that we were treating our detainees fairly and make reports on them. My job was to tour them around the detention facilities. Once a month, I took the delegation on a tour of our detention facilities. We would typically start large and then go down small. And the biggest detention facility was Camp Buca, which was like this huge, like sprawling tent city of about 1,000 detainees. So we would spend a couple of days there. And the ICRC would make their little reports, and I would have to write written responses to the reports. Most of the reports were, in fact, a large majority of them were pretty benign and somewhat fussy. For example, like detainee number 137 has a really bad back, so he needs a better mattress. Or once we had one was, the books in the library do not have enough classics. And I said, what do you mean by classics? Like what? And the lady said, oh, maybe some Moby Dick. So that's what my job was like. After the big facilities, we would go down and I would tour them to the smaller, more secret facilities where we had our high value detainees. And then finally, the very last stop of our tour was the smallest facility of all. That facility only held one detainee, and that guy we call prisoner number one, who was Saddam Hussein. The first time I went and visited Saddam Hussein started like all the other visits. So I picked up the delegation of the ICRC from the airport in Baghdad, and in an SUV where the windows in the back were blacked out with cardboard so they couldn't see outside, I drove in like random circles around and around and around until I got to his secret location. That secret location, which isn't secret now, was actually a villa on a lake that dozens of service members like ran around every morning. I was one of them, never knowing that there was a guy there, Saddam Hussein, who living there for 3 years as one of our prisoners. We entered the villa through an underground garage, and I ushered the ICRC delegation upstairs. Inside was a spacious room that was probably once a living room with really high ceilings and marble floors. The only furnishing in the room was a fold-out, like metal chair next to a metal door. After the delegation was like respectfully patted down by the guards, the guard stood up, opened up the metal door, and out came Saddam Hussein. And that was the first time I saw him. And the first time I saw him, the thing that I remember the most is he was grinning. Like he walked out of his cell like a man who was interrupted from some very important work, but he was delighted to see us. He had a big grin, wearing a white like dress shirt that looked a little well worn, but you could tell that he had taken care to keep it kind of pressed, and it was tucked into gray slacks. He had a neatly trimmed and brushed beard, and his hair, black and pepper gray, was also neatly brushed. And again, a big grin. I mean, he almost looked like somebody's uncle. When he came in, he greeted each of the member of the ICRC who were like standing in a line, like a receiving line, and he greeted each of them by name, and they all laughed and shook his hand. And I remember thinking, like, why are they laughing with this guy? This is Saddam Hussein. And then he got to me, and he stopped in front of me, and he looked me straight in the eyes, and he said, I haven't had the pleasure of meeting you yet. What's your name? He spoke perfect English, by the way, with just a hint of a British accent, which was really off-putting to me. So I just answered his question. I said, I'm Captain Goode. And he said, Captain Goode, it's good to meet you. And then he laughed. And he would continue to make that joke every time that I met him. After the introductions, he became the tour guide, and because it was my first time, he insisted on giving me a tour. So he took me into his cell with the guards following behind. And the cell was like a big, what used to be a bedroom. The villa that we had him detained in used to be one of his son's summer palaces. It was a big empty bedroom with nothing in it except in the corner there was a cot and like a crate that was used as a desk that he had a bunch of papers neatly stacked on. I did notice, by the way, that the cot was the same like army cot that I was sleeping on, but it did have an extra mattress on top. So I was like, oh, good job, ICRC. Guess you got him an extra mattress. There was also some photos on the wall. He never showed me the photos then, and he never invited me to see the photos. Instead, he just whisked us all through his room into his pride and joy, which was his garden. So his cell opened up onto a courtyard, which was about the same size as his cell. And it was empty. It was like white and pinkish white marble walls, and the top just like a little triangle or rectangle of sky. And his garden was, those, like if you go to a breakfast cafeteria or to a chow hall for breakfast, you get those little disposable cereal cups that you could take the tops off of and then just pour the milk straight in. Those were his pots. So think of like Pops, Rice Krispies, Raisin Bran. He had them all like lined up along the wall of his courtyard, and he was showing us the sprouts that were growing out of some of them. And he was proud. I was showing him, oh, that is an apple. This one is an orange. That's going to be a watermelon. And they were all seeds from the fruit that he was given with his meals. After the tour, we went back out to the main area. And that's when the ICRC handed him his cigars, which turned out was like a ritual. So the ICRC gave him cigars and he graciously accepted them. And then he turned and he like graciously, well, with mocking graciousness, turned them over to the guards who quickly confiscated them. At that point, the ICRC went into a private room with Saddam and to have their visit and conversation. And I sat with the guards and just waited. And you couldn't hear what they were saying, but you could hear the muffled conversation. And every now and then, just like the barking laughter of the Lebanese translator. And I remember being like so annoyed. Like, why are they joking and laughing with this guy? Don't they know what he's done? Like, it's Saddam Hussein. I continue to visit with the ICRC to see Saddam Hussein about 12 times. Each visit was pretty much the same as the first visit. It would start with the ritual of the cigars, and ICRC would hand him cigars, and he would then turn them over to the guards, and he would greet all of us. And whenever he got to me, he always grabbed my hand with both of his hands, looked me in the eyes, and said, "Oh, Captain Goode, it's good to see you." And then he would laugh at his joke, and I started laughing too. He seemed nice. And when the ICRC would talk to him in the cell, I would talk to the guards. And the guards would tell me how he also knew all of the guards' names and would ask them about their families. And they told me that he wrote poetry. And sometimes when he was done with the poem, he would like knock on the cell doors and so he could read his poetry to the guards. I could tell that these guys were charmed by their prisoner. They joked about him and they seemed almost proud of him, like the way they would talk about his poetry and how kind he was to them. I too was charmed by this like tidy professorial man in the white shirt who liked to garden and write poems, the man who greeted his captors as his guests. On my last visit to Saddam Hussein, during the ritual of the cigars, he stopped and he handed me one of the cigars before he turned the box over to the guards. And oh, I wanted to keep that cigar so bad, but I had to turn it over to the guards, so I did. And all through that, he was still wearing those gray slacks, the white shirt, and that was the last time I saw him that close. I did see him again, though, and that was shortly thereafter when I was sitting in the courtroom for one day of his trial. I was there to take notes for my boss. And he walked into the courtroom wearing, that same white shirt, gray slacks, beard nicely brushed, and he sat down flanked by his defense counsel. And he was still wearing a grin, but this time it wasn't the grin of the man who I met in his cell. This was something totally different. As I sat there and watched him, I saw him smile as the prosecutors described his crimes, as they described the torture and the murder, as they described the genocide. I saw him smile, scoff, sometimes laugh. He looked amused as the list of the atrocities went on. And sitting in that courtroom, I felt that bubble of his charisma just pop. All of his niceness was an illusion. I had mistaken his charm for character, and I'd allowed myself to be charmed because Saddam Hussein knew the power of a name. I allowed myself to be charmed because he looked me in the eyes and he called me by my name. Meanwhile, that Army colonel who was my boss, turns out totally nice guy. My first impression of him was wrong. He called me Marine that whole tour because he was awkward. And he had never worked with a Marine before, and he didn't really know what he was supposed to call me. And then he thought it was funny. He was also one of those guys that told a lot of jokes that just didn't laugh or didn't land. He was awkward, but otherwise just a great guy. And I got hit hard in the face by 2 books that deployment that I judged by their covers. And about a month after I returned home, I saw Saddam Hussein for the last time, and this time, though, it was through a shaky cell phone camera video. If you haven't seen it, don't Google it. It's the cell phone footage of his execution. In the footage, he was wearing that same white shirt. And at the end, after they take him down from the noose, there's like a close-up, or the cell phone kind of shows him lying there, and you could see clearly him with his white shirt on. And I stared at that shirt and I thought about the man who was responsible for genocide, the murderer, the guy who's quite frankly probably a psychopath. But at the same time, I was remembering the man who showed me his garden, who wrote poetry, and who always called me by my name.